Assalamu alaikum. Hello. I'm sorry I can't be there in Islamabad with you. I do want to express my gratitude, though, to Professor Safir and Khadija for inviting me to participate and for helping out with the technology so that I could be with you in some form. I hope the conference is going well. The ideas I'm going to share with you today, I'm calling Reading Trauma, English Language Pakistani Fiction, the Local Collective, and the Global Stage. The conference call for papers asks how literature is, quote, a measure of the conflicts and tortures, end quote, seemingly endemic to the end of the Cold War and the onset of, again, in the call's language, the perpetual tragedy of the post 9/11 world. As you recall, a call goes so far as to ask how, quote, literary praxis can be transformative. I take this interest in transformation both in terms of social, cultural, and political change and in terms of disciplinary inquiry. Indeed, the call directs us explicitly to consider how the field of trauma studies can be or needs to be transformed in these contexts. By way of a beginning, I want to attend briefly to these parameters. For instance, while in historical time we are all in the post-Cold War, post-9/11 world, our experience of this historical time is widely and wildly differential. Those differentials operate externally. For example, as an American citizen, a white woman living in the United States, I can make one type of differential between you and me quite clear. These differentials also operate internally, which means phenomenologically, Pakistanis as a group don't all experience this historical time in the same way, nor do Americans. A variety of factors feed into these differentials then, including class, gender, race, religion, geography, and so on. These differentials also prompt the need to decolonize the field of trauma studies. For as the call states, and the field itself has been discussing for roughly 15 years, if not more, trauma studies' roots in specific geographical locations and historical events define and confine its expanse and the transformative work it can do. Another parameter derived from the call that I want to pause over is the use of the word praxis. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, the roots of praxis lie in Latin and means the, quote, habitual or customary mode of action, method, technique, end quote. Praxis can also, quote, denote effect. The word's roots lead me to frame literature's possible transformative potential vis-a-vis trauma studies as a question about reading. I'll say more about this later. Before I go further, though, allow me to outline the ground that I'll cover. First, I'll review how postcolonial scholars have engaged with trauma studies in their attempts to decolonize this latter field. As I note above, this work has been ongoing for roughly 15 years. While my point isn't to offer any particularly new insights, there are some areas of emphasis to which I want to draw your attention. I'll then focus more intently on one of these areas, namely reading, particularly as praxis in the context of postcolonial interventions into trauma studies. My purpose here is to question how the ways we read, those learned habits and customs, connect to effects or patterns of meaning making that themselves connect to an idea of transmission, which is really important in decolonized trauma studies. Lastly, I'll turn to Uzma Aslam Khan's 2018 short story, My Mother is a Lunar Crater, which is already generating a lot of very positive critical response, to explore the implications of my more theoretical discussion. Of greatest interest to me in Khan's stories are the ways it engages transmission and trauma, which encourages me to imagine it as a text attuned to the differentials I mentioned above. In broad strokes, postcolonial scholars' interventions into trauma studies have focused on that field's tendency to individualize and to ahistoricize. Formulated another way, postcolonial scholars such as Ron Eierman, writing in 2001, and Steph Krapps and Gerd Whalens, co-authoring in 2008, have an interest in viewing trauma as collective and as enmeshed in history. Maria Root's concept of insidious trauma has gained much purchase in this regard. For Root, quote, insidious trauma's effects are cumulative and directed toward a community of people, end quote. These effects impact collectives, which necessarily locates trauma in place, at times, in cultures, social orders, economies, and other specificities. Importantly, Root further characterizes insidious traumas through their, quote, transmission of unresolved trauma and attendant defensive behavior and or helplessness that is transmitted transgenerationally as a result of an ancestor's direct trauma. The experiences of the previous generation result in the teaching of a worldview that incorporates the traumatic experience, end quote. Root's focus on the transgenerational aspects of cultural trauma resonates with Michael Rothberg's description of trauma in post-colonial contexts. For Rothberg, the, quote, intergenerational transmission of trauma exists alongside the problem of unequal recognition and disparate traumatic histories within and between the groups involved. That is, Rothberg is interested in differentials. Ron Eierman's refinement of cultural trauma highlights this within and between the groups involved. Eierman contends that, quote, cultural trauma refers to a dramatic loss of identity and meaning, a tear in the social fabric, affecting a group of people that has achieved some degree of cohesion, end quote. Eierman's cultural trauma paradigm identifies a victim who suffers loss, implying a perpetrator who doesn't. Moreover, Eierman grounds this victim's location in, quote, a group of people that has achieved some degree of cohesion, end quote. Pointedly, Eierman does not use collective nouns such as nation or society to refer to this group of people, leaving open the possibility that such groups can exist in varying degrees of relation to loss within the same nation or society. In pointing out this possibility, I am once again underscoring the idea of differentials. My emphasis on these differentials necessitates a corollary inquiry into what happens to cultural trauma as it is transmitted intergenerationally, as it gets incorporated into collective worldviews, to borrow again the words from Maria Root. What happens to the specificity of trauma and its effects in this transmission process? How or does the cohesion Eierman identifies obtain through this transmission process? Does generalization, dilution, or the erasure of differentials happen in this process? These questions are important because they help us understand dynamics that can be closely intertwined to the intergenerational transmission of cultural trauma. Those dynamics are complicity and appropriation, or rather the possibility of these dynamics operating in conjunction with transmission. We need to concern ourselves with these possibilities of complicity and appropriation if we are to understand more fully the potential transformative power of literary praxis in the context of the perpetual tragedy of the post-9/11 world. Here is where reading as praxis, as habit, as custom, as effect comes into view. As part of his efforts to revise trauma studies from its individualized and ahistoricized beginnings, that is, in his work to see what cultural trauma is, Michael Rothberg explicitly critiques decolonizing attempts by literary scholars that nonetheless provide individual readings of fictional characters. On the surface, Rothberg's point is that such analyses simply replicate trauma studies' traditional focus on individual psychology when they center fictional characters. At the same time, Rothberg's objection highlights what's habitual or customary about how we read. All too often, we read for character. We read to identify. Irene Visser recognizes this readerly habit as one way in which literature's role in transforming readers or societies or cultures after traumatic experiences is fraught. In other words, when we undertake reading as a way to when we undertake reading as a way to empathize with those who have suffered trauma, we promote vicariousness And we also universalize and appropriate, according to Joe Collins. We transmute the effects of the words on the page into actual human experience. We forget to attend to the mediating work that literature does. So when the likes of Steph Krapps and Gert Whalens refer to literary representations of trauma as testimonies, we need to be mindful of how such assertions of direct access to trauma through language may well be an act of, quote, epistemic violence, a point Joe Collins makes in her own analysis of reading's role in post-colonial trauma studies. To be direct then, I'm questioning how reading for identification or reading for character, an ingrained habit and custom, produces effects that work against the transformative potential of literature in the context of post-colonial trauma. We risk universalization, erasure, appropriation, the denial of complicity. The intergenerational transmission of trauma, insofar as it may shape collective worldviews, runs a parallel risk, especially when this transmission happens through story, which I mean in its most generic sense of narrative. With these thoughts in mind, I turn to Aslam Khan's story, My Mother is a Lunar Crater. My intention here is to highlight how reading otherwise, that is not necessarily or solely for identification, can bring to the fore the differentials so important to understanding trauma as a cultural phenomenon without appropriating it. I'll even go so far as to say that this story also insists on a collective reckoning that points to moments of structural or historical complicity. Significantly, I do not think that this reckoning's purpose is to foster or fuel opposition or unrest. Rather, and here's where the potential for transformation comes in, this reckoning can work to connect people through their acknowledgement of complicity. With respect to Aslam Khan's story, these possible connections work across geographies and histories, across the local and the global, a point I hope to make by highlighting the story's acts of intergenerational transmission. First, the simple plot. A mother travels from Pakistan to visit her daughter, a scientist in the United States. The daughter lives in Massachusetts. They are driving in a car to a natural history museum in Springfield, Massachusetts, and this trip's inspired by the daughter's interest in astronomy. They're lost, in part because the daughter's iPhone has lost its charge, leaving the GPS function disabled. Readers learn that the family has suffered a tragedy. A father and older daughter are dead. Eventually, the story reveals that they were both killed in a terrorist attack on, quote, 2 separate Ahmadi mosques in Lahore in 2010. The gunman followed the wounded to local hospitals, which is where both father and daughter were finally fatally injured. No character has a name, only a familial relation. This writerly choice paradoxically invites and obstructs reading for identification, as such intimate relations can be localized and domesticated, but they can also be anonymized via generalization. They can blind us to differentials. The story insists, though, on these differentials, in part by demonstrating how intergenerational transmission operates in traumatic contexts. The story traffics in metaphor, extending literarily a readerly invitation to consider how and why we might connect two unlike things as we interpret these metaphors. From there, the story takes on more trenchant and abiding traumas to delve further into questions of how we as readers position ourselves culturally, politically, and historically in relation to these traumas. In addition to the story's title, which is also its first sentence, the story features a metaphor as one of the narrator's central formative memories. Her father, said El-Biruni, for whom the lunar crater is named, had found a way to measure the tilt of heavenly bodies through creating an early form of astrolabe. What did it look like? My father hesitated. I think he had never seen one. Then he said astrolabe, using the Persian word aktaryab, meant star taker. The father's star-taking metaphor prompts both of his daughters to imagine an astrolabe as, quote, something resembling a long telescope with a cluster of bright stars caught inside. The girls' reception of their father's metaphor performs an act of intergenerational transmission, showing how a culturally significant narrative gets passed down and re-signified. This example is benign. After all, the narrator remembers her father's words as part of what piqued her interest in astronomy. This example, though, does introduce a pattern in the story that recurs in a more charged context. This context involves the story's gradual revelation of why the father and daughter were targeted by terrorists. They were Ahmadis. Before the story provides the details of the attack, the narrator shares other family memories, including how her father used to tease her mother about her prayer beads, quote, arguing that Ahmadis had no use for them, uttering Ahmadi with more ease than anyone I know, end quote. The father's ease with the name of his religious identity is striking, given the persecution Ahmadis have faced historically. To own that identity is to put oneself at risk in Pakistan. The father's ease marks his resistance in the face of an abiding trauma, and the narrator's awe at that ease, at saying what she sees as a forbidden word, also performs transmission. In this instance, re-signification occurs again. In its transmitted form, the trauma encompassing the word Ahmadi incorporates fear into the narrator's worldview. The story's introduction of the family's Ahmadi identity emphasizes a differential operating internal to Pakistan, which itself draws upon a long political, religious, and cultural history that variegates readers there. At the same time, the story invokes another trauma, highlighting yet another differential that makes possible perhaps unexpected and unthinkable connections, should readers choose to see them. Specifically, the narrator situates her mother's visit to the US in the context of the extra-fictional reality of the US's current presidential administration. When the mother expresses her concerns about her ability to secure a visa, her daughter replies, quote, "The ban is not yet against Pakistan." At once, this reply broadens the story's view to include the ugly, discriminatory policies operating presently in the United States, thereby implicitly castigating Americans for this latest iteration of their post-9/11 hatred. Simultaneously, this reply underscores a terrible irony. As the narrator recounts the passport-related troubles she had trying to get back to Pakistan when her father and sister were killed, she thinks that her father's pride in her professional success, quote, would help him to forget that our passports had a column where we were listed as infidels. It might also help him forget, too, that in the United States, where it is not illegal to declare ourselves Muslims, this was not a helpful word either. In both countries, for different reasons, we were unsafe if we named ourselves. This expanded geopolitical frame shifts the differentials, introducing a dynamic external to the specifics of Pakistan's domestic relations. In doing so, this story lays out yet another traumatic history and suggests its additional acts of transmission that continue to shape worldviews. Curiously or crucially, depending on your commitments, these worldviews offer the possibility of connection across the very groups who the story addresses. It's a story about Pakistan. It's a story written in English. And it insists that we must reckon with the trauma that we inflict and that we suffer. Thank you very much for your attention. Again, I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.